Welcome to this summary of Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future by Dan Wang. Imagine standing in Shanghai in 1990, looking out at muddy farmland across the river. Now fast forward to today, and that same view shows you a gleaming forest of skyscrapers, a financial district that rivals Manhattan, connected by magnetic levitation trains and underground metros that put most Western cities to shame. How did this happen? And more importantly, what can we learn from it? That's what Dan Wang sets out to explore in this book. He's not your typical China watcher sitting in Washington or New York analyzing spreadsheets and policy documents. Wang has spent years on the ground in China, walking through factories, riding high-speed trains, and talking to engineers, entrepreneurs, and officials. What he's discovered challenges many of our assumptions about how countries develop, what drives innovation, and what actually matters for creating prosperity. Over the next 50 minutes, we're going to explore China's incredible transformation, not through the usual lens of politics or human rights, but through something more fundamental: engineering, manufacturing, and the relentless pursuit of building things that work. So buckle up. We're about to take a journey through the factories, rail lines, and semiconductor plants that are reshaping our world. Let's start with something concrete, something you can actually see and touch. In 2008, China opened its first high-speed rail line, connecting Beijing to Tianjin. Just one line, about 70 miles long. Today, less than 2 decades later, China has built over 25,000 miles of high-speed rail. That's more than the rest of the world combined. To put that in perspective, if you laid out all of China's high-speed rail tracks, they'd circle the Earth at the equator. But here's what's really mind-blowing. They didn't just build a lot of track. They built it fast, they built it well, and they built it cheaper than anyone else. A mile of high-speed rail in China costs about half what it costs in Europe, and a quarter of what it costs in California. How is this possible? Wang argues that we often misunderstand what made this happen. We think it's about authoritarian efficiency or cheap labor or disregard for environmental concerns, but that's not the full story. The real answer is something deeper, something about how China approaches the entire process of building things. Think about how the United States builds infrastructure. First, there are years of environmental reviews, then community consultations, then litigation, then design competitions, then more litigation. Then construction begins, but it's done by contractors who bid on the project and often have little experience with this specific technology involved. Every stage is fragmented, delayed, adversarial. China does it differently. They've created what Wang calls systems integration, bringing design, manufacturing, and construction under one umbrella. The same organizations that design the trains also build the tracks and operate the lines. They learn from each project and immediately apply those lessons to the next one. It's not just about building one high-speed rail line. It's about building a system for building high-speed rail lines. And this creates a flywheel effect. The more you build, the better you get at building. Your costs go down, your speed goes up. Your workers become more skilled. Your processes become more refined. This is the first big lesson from China's playbook. Velocity matters. Not just moving fast for the sake of speed, but moving fast so you can learn fast. Every rail line built is a lesson learned. Every station constructed is an experiment in efficiency. Now, let's dig deeper into what makes all this speed possible. Wang introduces a concept that's central to understanding China's success: process knowledge. You've probably heard about research and development. You've probably heard about patents and intellectual property. These are what economists call codified knowledge, things you can write down, patent, license, or teach in a classroom. But process knowledge is different. It's the knowledge of how to actually make things.
It's the thousand tiny adjustments a factory worker makes to keep a production line running smoothly. It's the way a construction crew coordinates to pour concrete at exactly the right temperature and humidity. It's the informal tips and tricks that experienced engineers pass down to newcomers. And here's the thing about process knowledge. You can't learn it from a textbook. You can't download it from the internet. You can't patent it or license it. You can only get it by doing, by building things over and over until you've internalized all the subtle lessons about what works and what doesn't. And this is where China has a massive advantage. While Western countries have been offshoring manufacturing for decades, focusing on high-value activities like design and branding, China has been accumulating process knowledge at an unprecedented scale. Wang tells the story of visiting a factory that makes smartphones. The company's engineers explained that when they started, they were just assembling parts designed by others, but through the sheer repetition of making millions of phones, they began to understand the products better than the original designers did. They knew which screws were unnecessary. They knew which components could be integrated. They knew how to shave a millimeter off the thickness without compromising durability. That knowledge didn't come from a university. It didn't come from reading patents. It came from making stuff. And here's the kicker. Once you have process knowledge, you can iterate incredibly fast. You don't need to run expensive R&D experiments or do lengthy theoretical studies. You just try something new on the production line, see if it works, and adjust. It's learning by doing at massive scale. This is why China can take a technology that was invented elsewhere, like solar panels or electric vehicles, and quickly become the world's dominant producer. It's not because they're stealing secrets. It's because they've built the process knowledge that lets them manufacture these things better, faster, and cheaper than anyone else. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about where all this manufacturing actually happens. When you think of China's economy, you might picture factories scattered randomly across the country. But Wang shows us something more interesting. China's manufacturing is organized into incredibly dense, specialized clusters. Take Shenzhen, for example. This city, just across the border from Hong Kong, has become the hardware capital of the world. If you want to build an electronic device, anything from a smartwatch to a drone to an electric scooter, Shenzhen is where you go. Why? Because everything you need is within a few miles. Need a specialized chip? There's a supplier down the street. Need custom injection molded plastic cases? There's a factory in the next district. Need someone who can debug your circuit board design? There are a dozen engineers at the coffee shop on the corner. Wang describes visiting these electronics markets in Shenzhen. Massive multi-story buildings packed with tiny stalls, each selling different components. You can walk through with a sketch of a product idea, and by the end of the day, you've sourced every component you need and found a factory that can assemble it. And they can have your first prototype ready in a week. This is what economists call clustering effects or agglomeration benefits. But those dry terms don't capture how magical it actually feels. It's like cooking in a kitchen where you have to drive to the store for every ingredient, versus cooking in a kitchen where everything is already within arm's reach. The same thing happens with other industries in other cities. Dongguan specializes in furniture and toys. Yiwu is the global center for small commodities. If you've ever bought cheap sunglasses or phone cases online, they probably came from Yiwu. Wenzhou makes shoes. Each cluster develops its own ecosystem of suppliers, manufacturers, designers, and logistics companies. And here's what's really important. These clusters create a self-reinforcing cycle. The more companies in an industry that locate in one place, the more attractive that place becomes for other companies in the same industry. Specialized suppliers emerge. Skilled workers are easier to find. Knowledge spreads quickly through informal networks. This geographic concentration is one of China's secret weapons. It's incredibly hard to replicate. You can't just decide to build a new Shenzhen somewhere else. These ecosystems take decades to develop, and they depend on countless small decisions by thousands of companies all choosing to locate near each other.
Let's talk about something that might seem boring, but is actually fascinating. Infrastructure. Americans tend to think of infrastructure as something you build once and then forget about. You build a highway in the 1960s, patch it occasionally, and that's it. Infrastructure is maintenance, not excitement. China sees infrastructure completely differently. For them, infrastructure is the foundation of everything else. It's not just about having roads and bridges, it's about constantly building new, better infrastructure that enables new forms of economic activity. Wang gives us a powerful example. Before China built its high-speed rail network, traveling from Beijing to Shanghai took about 12 hours by train. Most business people flew instead, but flying meant getting to the airport early, dealing with security, potential delays, and travel time from and to airports. Door to door, it was often a full day of travel. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room, the role of government. When Western observers look at China's economic success, they often focus on the state's heavy hand. Government subsidies, state-owned enterprises, 5-year plans. And there's often an assumption that this is all inefficient and unsustainable, propped up by artificial support. Wang's take is more nuanced. Yes, the Chinese government plays a huge role in the economy, but the interesting question isn't whether the government is involved, it's how they're involved. China's industrial policy isn't just about picking winners or throwing money at favorite industries, it's about creating ecosystems where companies can thrive. Here's an example. When China decided to develop its electric vehicle industry, they didn't just subsidize one national champion and hope for the best. Instead, they did several things simultaneously. They subsidized consumer purchases to create demand. They invested in charging infrastructure. They used government procurement to buy electric buses. They set technical standards. They created special economic zones for EV manufacturers. They encouraged competition among multiple domestic companies, and they allowed foreign companies to participate, so Chinese firms could learn from them. The result? China now produces more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined. And it's not just one or two companies. There are dozens of EV makers, competing fiercely with each other, each trying different approaches. This is what Wang describes as competitive intensity within a directed framework. The government sets a direction and creates favorable conditions, but then lets companies duke it out to see who can execute best. Compare this to how industrial policy has often worked in the West. Governments pick a single company or technology, bet big on it, and then stick with it even when it's clearly not working. Think of European governments pouring money into their national airlines, or the US backing specific clean energy companies that then go bankrupt. China's approach is more Darwinian. They're comfortable letting companies fail as long as the overall ecosystem is moving in the right direction. They're willing to subsidize overcapacity because they know that brutal competition will eventually shake out the winners. Is this approach perfect? No. There's waste, corruption, and plenty of failed bets. But Wang argues that this high-variance approach, trying lots of things, accepting lots of failures, but occasionally hitting massive successes, is actually more effective than the risk-averse approach common in developed economies. Now the high-speed rail makes the same trip in 4.5 hours. City center to city center. No airport hassles. You can leave Beijing after breakfast and be at a meeting in Shanghai before lunch. This doesn't just save time, it fundamentally changes the geography of economic opportunity. Cities that were too far apart for daily business interaction are now close. Labor markets become more integrated. Companies can locate in cheaper cities while still accessing the talent in expensive ones. Ideas spread faster. And China hasn't stopped with rail. They're building massive new subway systems in dozens of cities. They're constructing new airports at a breakneck pace. They're creating logistics networks that can deliver packages to almost anywhere in the country within 24 hours. But here's what's really interesting. This infrastructure isn't just about connecting places, it's about creating new possibilities. Think about it like this. In the early days of the internet, people thought it would be useful for sending emails and looking up information.
They didn't predict YouTube or Uber or Instagram or any of the other things that would become possible once you had universal high-speed connectivity. The infrastructure enabled innovations that nobody had imagined. China's approach to physical infrastructure is similar. They're building networks that are so fast, so dense, so comprehensive that they'll enable economic activities nobody has thought of yet. This is what Wang calls infrastructure ahead of demand. Build it first and the uses will follow. It's the opposite of the cautious, incremental approach common in the West, where you wait until there's proven demand before making investments. Is this risky? Sure, not every infrastructure project will pay off, but Wang argues that the real risk is moving too slowly, getting left behind while others race ahead.
Okay, let's address the elephant in the room, the role of government. When Western observers look at China's economic success, they often focus on the state's heavy hand, government subsidies, state-owned enterprises, 5-year plans. And there's often an assumption that this is all inefficient and unsustainable, propped up by artificial support. Wang's take is more nuanced. Yes, the Chinese government plays a huge role in the economy. But the interesting question isn't whether the government is involved, it's how they're involved. China's industrial policy isn't just about picking winners or throwing money at favored industries. It's about creating ecosystems where companies can thrive. Here's an example. When China decided to develop its electric vehicle industry, they didn't just subsidize one national champion and hope for the best. Instead, they did several things simultaneously. They subsidized consumer purchases to create demand. They invested in charging infrastructure. They used government procurement to buy electric buses. They set technical standards. They created special economic zones for EV manufacturers. They encouraged competition among multiple domestic companies, and they allowed foreign companies to participate so Chinese firms could learn from them. The result? China now produces more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined. And it's not just one or two companies. There are dozens of EV makers competing fiercely with each other, each trying different approaches. This is what Wang describes as competitive intensity within a directed framework. The government sets a direction and creates favorable conditions, but then lets companies duke it out to see who can execute best. Compare this to how industrial policy has often worked in the West. Governments pick a single company or technology, bet big on it, and then stick with it even when it's clearly not working. Think of European governments pouring money into their national airlines, or the U.S. backing specific clean energy companies that then go bankrupt. China's approach is more Darwinian. They're comfortable letting companies fail as long as the overall ecosystem is moving in the right direction. They're willing to subsidize overcapacity because they know that brutal competition will eventually shake out the winners. Is this approach perfect? No. There's waste, corruption, and plenty of failed bets. But Wang argues that this high-variance approach, trying lots of things, accepting lots of failures, but occasionally hitting massive successes, is actually more effective than the risk-averse approach common in developed economies. Now let's talk about the frontier of China's ambitions, semiconductors. Chips are the oil of the 21st century. Everything runs on them. Your phone, your car, your refrigerator, the data centers powering the internet, weapon systems, AI models, all of it depends on semiconductors. And here's the problem for China. Despite being the world's manufacturing powerhouse, they're highly dependent on imported chips, especially the most advanced ones. The most cutting-edge semiconductors are made by just a handful of companies, primarily TSMC in Taiwan, Samsung in South Korea, and Intel in the United States, using equipment made by companies like ASML in the Netherlands. This is China's Achilles heel. In a geopolitical crisis, their access to advanced chips could be cut off, crippling their entire economy and military.
So China has made semiconductor self-sufficiency a top national priority. They're pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into the industry. They're recruiting talent from around the world. They're building fabrication plants. They're trying to develop every piece of the supply chain domestically. But here's the thing. Making advanced semiconductors is really, really hard. Wang explains that semiconductors represent the pinnacle of process knowledge. The machines used to make them are among the most complex things humans have ever built. A single advanced lithography machine from ASML can cost over $100 million and requires innovations from dozens of different fields of science and engineering. This isn't something you can just copy or catch up to quickly. It's taken decades of accumulated knowledge, hundreds of billions in R&D, and countless iterations to get where the industry leaders are today. So can China catch up? Wang is cautiously optimistic but realistic about the challenges. On one hand, China has some advantages. They have plenty of capital, political will, and a large domestic market. They're willing to be patient and accept losses in the short term. And they're very good at that process knowledge we talked about earlier. On the other hand, semiconductors might be the one area where the Western approach, deep scientific research, openness to talent from around the world, and freedom to pursue unconventional ideas has intrinsic advantages over China's more directed approach. The semiconductor race is still playing out. It's probably the single most important technological competition of the next few decades, and the outcome will shape not just China's future, but the global balance of power. We need to take a moment to acknowledge something important. This story of rapid progress has real human costs. Wang doesn't shy away from this. The breakneck speed of development has meant displacement, environmental damage, and enormous pressure on workers. Think about what it actually means when a city builds a new subway line in 3 years instead of 10. It means construction crews working around the clock. It means neighborhoods being torn up and rebuilt. It means people being relocated, sometimes without adequate compensation. It means taking shortcuts that might not be taken in a society with stronger protections for individual rights. The factory workers who make all these products often work long hours in difficult conditions. The rural migrants who built the high-speed rail and the skyscrapers live far from their families, sending money home but missing their children growing up. And then there's the environmental impact. All this manufacturing produces pollution. The rapid industrialization has left cities with air quality that can be hazardous. Rivers have been contaminated. Agricultural land has been converted to factories and urban sprawl. Wang doesn't present this as a simple trade-off, progress versus human welfare. But he does argue that we need to understand the full picture. The story of China's rise isn't just about clever industrial policy and engineering prowess. It's also about the millions of people whose lives were transformed, for better and for worse, by these massive changes. It's worth noting that China itself is now grappling with these issues. As the country gets wealthier, there's more public pressure for environmental protection, labor rights, and social services. The model that worked for rapid catch-up development may not be the model that works for a mature, wealthy society.
Let's address a question that comes up constantly when people discuss China. Can they really innovate, or are they just good at copying? This question often comes with a lot of cultural baggage. There's a persistent stereotype that Chinese culture emphasizes conformity and rote learning, that their education system stifles creativity, that their political system is incompatible with the kind of free thinking necessary for breakthrough innovation. Wang pushes back hard against this narrative, but in a nuanced way. First, he points out that the question itself is based on a narrow definition of innovation. When people say innovation, they often mean radical, breakthrough inventions, the light bulb, the smartphone, the internet. But this represents only a tiny slice of what actually drives economic progress.
Most innovation is incremental. It's making an existing product a little bit better, a little bit cheaper, a little bit more reliable. It's figuring out how to manufacture something at scale. It's adapting a technology from one industry to work in another. And at this kind of innovation, process innovation, manufacturing innovation, incremental improvement, China excels. Think about solar panels. The basic technology was invented in the West, but Chinese companies figured out how to make them so cheaply that they've transformed the economics of renewable energy. That's innovation. It might not be sexy, but it's changed the world. Or think about mobile payments. The technology existed in the West first, but it was Chinese companies like Alipay and WeChat Pay that figured out how to make it ubiquitous, creating an entire ecosystem where you can go weeks without using cash. That said, Wang acknowledges that China still lags in certain types of fundamental scientific research and breakthrough innovation. Chinese companies have produced relatively few products that define entirely new categories or industries. But Wang argues this might be changing. As China accumulates more manufacturing knowledge, as its companies move up the value chain, as its researchers gain more experience and resources, we might see more breakthrough innovations emerging from China. And maybe the whole framing, Western innovation versus Chinese copying, is outdated. Perhaps the future of innovation is about combining different strengths. Maybe the winning formula is Western-style fundamental research paired with Chinese-style manufacturing and scaling expertise. Let's shift gears and talk about the implications for the rest of the world. What can other countries learn from China's experience? Wang is careful not to suggest that every country should just copy China's model. Different societies have different values, institutions, and constraints. What works in China might not work elsewhere. But he does think there are some important lessons. First, speed matters more than we think. The Western world has become extremely risk-averse and process-oriented. Everything requires lengthy studies, reviews, consultations, and approvals. This might make sense for avoiding mistakes, but it also means we move glacially slow on everything. China shows that there's value in just trying things and learning as you go. Build the rail line, see what works, and adjust. Don't spend a decade in planning hell. Second, manufacturing matters more than we've been telling ourselves. For years, the prevailing wisdom in the West was that rich countries should focus on services, finance, and high-tech design, while leaving dirty manufacturing to poorer countries. But China's experience suggests that manufacturing is where a lot of crucial learning happens. The process knowledge gained from actually making things is invaluable. If you lose manufacturing, you might eventually lose the ability to innovate in those areas too. Third, infrastructure is more important than it seems. It's not just about fixing potholes or preventing bridge collapses. World-class infrastructure enables new forms of economic activity. It knits regions together. It compounds over time. Fourth, industrial policy can work if done right. The lesson isn't that governments should plan the economy. It's that smart, adaptive industrial policy, creating ecosystems, investing in infrastructure, encouraging competition while setting direction, can accelerate development. Fifth, there's value in having a long-term orientation. China thinks in decades, not quarterly earning cycles or four-year election cycles. They're willing to make investments that might not pay off for a generation. That's hard to do in democracies with short-term political pressures, but it's worth trying to find ways to enable more long-term thinking. Now, here's the important caveat. None of this means abandoning democratic values, human rights, or environmental protection. The question is whether we can capture some of the benefits of China's approach, the speed, the ambition, the focus on building things, while maintaining our commitments to individual freedom and accountability. That's the challenge for the West. Can we build infrastructure faster while still protecting community input? Can we support manufacturing while ensuring worker rights? Can we have industrial policy without picking winners and stifling competition? There are no easy answers, but Wang argues these are the questions we need to be asking. So where's all this heading? What does the future look like for China and for the world? Wang is careful not to make overly confident predictions. There are too many variables, too many unknowns, but he sketches out some possibilities. One scenario is that China continues its upward trajectory, gradually closing the gap with the most advanced economies in every area. In this future, China becomes a genuine peer competitor to the United States, not just in economic size, but in technological sophistication. They crack the semiconductor problem, develop world-leading AI, and become the innovation hub for the global South. Another scenario is that China hits a wall. Maybe the same political system that enabled rapid infrastructure development becomes a constraint as the economy matures. Maybe the lack of free information flow limits scientific breakthrough. Maybe the demographic challenges, an aging population, declining birth rates, become overwhelming. Maybe the environmental costs catch up with them. A third scenario is divergence. China and the West developing parallel but separate technological ecosystems, different standards, different platforms, different supply chains. The world splits into spheres of influence, with some countries oriented towards the Chinese system and others towards the Western one. Wang doesn't tell us which scenario he thinks is most likely, but he emphasizes one thing: we shouldn't underestimate China's capabilities. For too long, Western observers have been predicting imminent collapse or stagnation, and they've been repeatedly proven wrong. China has real challenges ahead. The easy phase of development, catching up by copying and adapting existing technologies, is largely over. The next phase requires pushing the frontier forward, and that's much harder. But they have some powerful advantages: enormous scale, accumulated manufacturing expertise, political will, and a demonstrated ability to execute ambitious projects. The race is far from over. In fact, it's just getting interesting.
Let's zoom out even further and think about what this all means for how we understand economic development and progress. For a long time, there was a dominant narrative about how countries become wealthy. You start with agriculture, move to basic manufacturing, then to more sophisticated manufacturing, and finally to a service and knowledge economy. Along the way, you gradually develop democratic institutions, protect property rights, and embrace free markets. This was the playbook. This was the Washington Consensus, the advice that international institutions gave to developing countries. China's rise challenges this narrative in fundamental ways. They've achieved extraordinary economic progress without following the prescribed path. They've shown that there are multiple routes to prosperity. Wang argues that we need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what drives development. It's not just about having the right institutions or the right policies. It's about building capabilities, the ability to actually do things, to make things, to coordinate complex projects. Think about it this way. You could give a developing country perfect property rights, an independent judiciary, and free elections. But if they don't have the knowledge and skills to build things efficiently, they won't become prosperous. Institutions matter, but capabilities matter too. And capabilities are built through practice. You learn to manufacture by manufacturing. You learn to build infrastructure by building infrastructure. This is why the doing matters so much. This has implications for how we think about helping other countries develop. Maybe instead of just advising them on policy reforms, we should be helping them build capabilities. Help them set up manufacturing clusters, help them train engineers, help them develop process knowledge. It also has implications for how developed countries think about their own economies. Maybe we've been too quick to offshore manufacturing and focus on higher value activities. Maybe there's wisdom in maintaining diverse industrial capabilities, even if it's not the most economically efficient in the short term. China's rise isn't happening in isolation. It's reshaping the entire global economy. For decades, the global economic order was centered on the West, primarily the United States and Europe. They were the consumers, the innovators, the standard setters. Developing countries were suppliers of raw materials and cheap labor. But that's changing. China is now a major consumer market in its own right. They're setting technical standards, especially in areas like 5G and electric vehicles. They're exporting infrastructure through initiatives like the Belt and Road. This is creating new opportunities, but also new tensions. Countries around the world are being forced to navigate between the Western and Chinese economic systems. Do you adopt Chinese telecommunications equipment because it's cheaper and better, even though the U.S. warns about security risks? Do you accept Chinese infrastructure investment, even if it comes with strings attached? Wang notes that this competition might actually be healthy in some ways. For years, developing countries had only one model to follow and one set of institutions to deal with. Now, they have options. They can play competing powers against each other. They can pick and choose elements from different approaches. But the competition also brings risks. There's the danger of conflict, whether economic or military. There's the risk of the world splitting into rival blocs that don't trade or cooperate with each other. That would be bad for everyone. The ideal outcome, Wang suggests, is a world where different systems compete but also cooperate, where China and the West push each other to do better, but where there's enough integration and mutual interest to prevent conflict. Whether we'll get that ideal outcome is anyone's guess, but understanding China's strengths and its approach is essential for navigating the future, whatever it brings. So, what's the big picture here? What's the core message we should take away from Breakneck? I think it's this. China's rise isn't just a story about one country's success. It's a reminder of the fundamental importance of building things, of manufacturing, of infrastructure, of accumulated knowledge that comes from doing. We live in a world that often prizes abstract thinking, finance, software, design, over the physical. We celebrate entrepreneurs who build apps, not factories. We write about innovations in business models, not innovations in production processes. But China's experience shows that the physical world still matters enormously. The ability to actually make things, to build infrastructure, to coordinate complex projects, these capabilities are the foundation of prosperity. This doesn't mean that everyone should try to become China. Different societies have different strengths and values. But it does mean we need to take manufacturing and engineering more seriously. We need to value the unglamorous work of incremental improvement. We need to invest in infrastructure and industrial capabilities, not just abstract knowledge. For policymakers, the message is that industrial policy and long-term strategic thinking matter. You can't just leave everything to markets and hope for the best. Smart government investment in infrastructure, research, and ecosystem building can make a huge difference. For businesses, the message is that process knowledge and manufacturing excellence are competitive advantages that are hard to replicate. The companies that will thrive are those that don't just design products, but deeply understand how to make them. For individuals, especially young people thinking about careers, there's a message too. The world needs people who can build things. Engineers, project managers, manufacturing specialists, these aren't boring, outdated careers. They're crucial for solving the world's problems, from climate change to pandemics to inequality. Dan Wang's Breakneck is ultimately an optimistic book. Yes, it's clear-eyed about China's problems and challenges, but it's also a reminder that rapid progress is possible, that countries can transform themselves in a generation, that ambitious goals, when pursued with focus and determination, can be achieved.
In a world that often feels stuck, where infrastructure projects take forever, where problems seem intractable, where progress feels slow, China's breakneck transformation offers a different vision. It shows that with the right approach, things can change fast. The question for the rest of us is, what can we learn from this? How can we capture some of that ambition, that focus on building, that willingness to try things and learn fast, while staying true to our own values? That's the conversation we need to be having.
If there's one thing I hope you take away, it's this. The future isn't predetermined. China's success didn't just happen. It was built, literally built, through countless decisions to invest in infrastructure, to focus on manufacturing, to accumulate the practical knowledge that comes from making things at scale. And that means other countries, other societies can shape their own futures too. Not by copying China exactly, but by learning from what worked, the bias toward action, the long-term thinking, the focus on capabilities and not just policies. The world is being reshaped right now by the choices countries and companies are making about what to build, where to invest, and what knowledge to pursue. Understanding China's approach isn't just about understanding one country. It's about understanding the forces that will shape all of our futures. So whether you're a policymaker, a business leader, an engineer, or just someone who cares about how the world works, I hope this summary has given you new ways to think about progress, development, and what it takes to build a better future. Keep building, keep learning, and remember, velocity matters. You know, there's something almost poetic about the word breakneck. It implies danger, recklessness even. But it also captures something essential about ambition, the willingness to move so fast that you might stumble because standing still feels like the greater risk. When Dan Wang walked through those factories in Shenzhen, rode those high-speed trains across China, and watched entire skylines transform in the span of a few years, he wasn't just documenting economic statistics. He was witnessing a fundamental truth about human potential, that when we commit fully to building something, when we combine vision with execution, when we're willing to learn from every failure and iterate relentlessly, remarkable things become possible. But here's what keeps me up at night, and maybe it'll resonate with you too. While China was laying 25,000 miles of high-speed rail, much of the developed world was arguing about whether we could afford to fix our crumbling bridges. While Chinese cities were building subway systems in 3 years, other cities were spending a decade just planning theirs. While Chinese companies were mastering the art of manufacturing at scale, Western companies were celebrating asset-light business models that outsourced the messy work of actually making things. There's a generation of young people right now who've never seen their own countries build something truly ambitious and succeed, who've grown up in a world where big projects always run over budget and behind schedule, where infrastructure is something that decays rather than expands, where disruption means apps and software, not steel and concrete and the rewiring of physical space. That has costs we're only beginning to understand, not just economic costs, but psychological ones. The loss of belief that big things are possible, the sense that our best days are behind us. China's story, whatever you think of its political system, whatever concerns you have about its human rights record, offers an alternative narrative. It says progress is still possible. Transformation can happen fast. The future can be better than the present. And maybe that's the most important lesson here. Not the specific policies or strategies, but the mindset, the belief that stagnation isn't inevitable, that we can choose to build.
Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about worshiping China or ignoring its very real problems. It's not about abandoning democratic values or accepting authoritarian solutions. The question isn't whether we should become more like China in every way. The question is whether we can rediscover our own capacity for ambition and execution while staying true to our principles. Can we build world-class infrastructure while protecting community voices? Can we support manufacturing without exploiting workers? Can we have industrial policy without corruption and cronyism? Can we move with urgency without sacrificing environmental protection? These are hard questions. They don't have easy answers, but they're the right questions to be asking. Because here's the thing. The challenges we face, climate change, pandemic preparedness, aging infrastructure, technological competition, they all require us to build things, real, physical things. Solar panels and wind turbines, vaccine manufacturing facilities, high-speed rail and electric vehicle charging networks, semiconductor fabs and battery factories. We can't app our way out of these problems. We can't financial engineer our way to solutions. We have to actually build. And building requires all those things we've been talking about: process knowledge, industrial clusters, infrastructure investment, long-term thinking, and yes, the willingness to move at breakneck speed when the moment demands it. So here's my challenge to you as we close out. Think about what breakneck speed looks like in your own life, your own work, your own community. Maybe you're an engineer who's been playing it safe. Consider what ambitious project you could tackle if you gave yourself permission to move faster and learn as you go. Maybe you're in business, outsourcing production to cut costs. Ask yourself what capabilities you're losing, what knowledge is walking out the door, and whether short-term savings are worth long-term strategic weakness. Or maybe you're in government or public policy. Challenge the assumption that everything has to take 10 years and 3 environmental reviews. Ask whether the greater risk is moving too fast or moving too slow. Or maybe you're a student trying to decide what to study and where to invest your energy. Consider that the world desperately needs people who can build things, who understand manufacturing, who can turn ideas into reality at scale. Those skills are rare, valuable, and increasingly crucial. Whatever your role, whatever your sphere of influence, you have the power to choose a different tempo, to bias toward action over endless deliberation, to value execution as much as strategy, to remember that progress isn't just about having the right ideas, it's about implementing them with speed and skill. Dan Wang's Breakneck isn't ultimately a book about China. It's a book about what humans can accomplish when we commit to building, when we focus on capabilities, and when we refuse to accept that slow and stuck is the only way forward. The breakneck speed isn't the recklessness of moving too fast. It's the courage to move at all. So as you go about your day, your week, your career, I hope you'll carry that with you. The knowledge that transformation is possible, that ambitious goals can be achieved, that the future is something we build, not something that just happens to us. The question isn't whether your country or company can match China's exact achievements. The question is, what could you build if you truly tried? What could your community accomplish if it moved with purpose? What could your generation create if it rediscovered the belief that big things are possible? Those are questions worth asking. And more importantly, they're questions worth answering, not with words, but with action. Thank you so much for listening. If this summary resonated with you, I encourage you to pick up Dan Wang's full book. His insights go much deeper than we could cover in an hour, and his writing brings these ideas to life with nuance and richness that no summary can fully capture. Keep building, keep learning, and keep moving forward. And remember, in a world that often feels stuck, Velocity isn't just about speed. It's about momentum. It's about belief. It's about the choice to make progress rather than wait for permission. The future is being built right now. The only question is, will you be part of building it? Until next time, this has been your summary of Breakneck, China's quest to engineer the future. Now, go build something remarkable.